just hit record right now. So when I was in rabbinical school, one of the things that they had us do in our books was actually write in our books. And my mother was horrified because I had learned my entire life, you never write in a book. And then I got to rabbinical school, and they're like, how are you going to actually ever remember anything if you didn't write it in the book? Which, by the way, if we're going to talk about writing in the book at high holiday time, the whole metaphor is about, writing in a book. So I encourage you, if you want to take notes in the margin of your page, and by the way, there are ancient manuscripts of pretty much almost every Jewish manuscript that you can imagine that actually has handwritten notes in the margin. So it's a long, long tradition. But if you hear something that's interesting to you that you might want to be thinking about on Rosh Hashanah, and if you're like me, by Rosh Hashanah I'll have forgotten what I heard that was interesting, feel free to take notes in the margin. So I want to just say something about the Mahzor. The Mahzor, our prayer book that we use on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the word Mahzor itself comes from the root chazar, which means, lachzor means to return. So the very name of the book emphasizes the idea that there's a turning or a return. Of course, part of it is that we return to this book every year. The book stays the same. We change. Just move my camera a tad there. But also obviously the idea of turning, of changing, of the ability, in theory, of using this book during the high holidays to enable us to help affect the turning and the change that we want to have happen during the high holiday period, and of course for the entire year. The challenge, I would say, of the Mahzor is that it's a unique. It resembles the Siddur in many ways. Obviously, many of the prayers are familiar to us from the Siddur. We have the Shema, we have the Amidah, we have the Michamocha, we have all the different Kaddishes. So the structure of the Siddur, of the Mahzor, is very similar to the Siddur. It's just that there are extra things that are plugged in that are unique to the high holiday time. The challenge is that many of us are not familiar with the Siddur at all. When the Mahzor really came into being, it was designed for a group of people. Let's say, we'll even say even more specifically, a group of men that were fairly literate in the work of the Siddur. And so without actually having to be told, they knew exactly what was in the Siddur, what was similar and what was different. And they also understood that the tone of the Mahzor was specific to the time period. That it's a time period that's in some ways very somber and a little frightening, and we're talking about being judged, and we're talking about, all the things that we did wrong. But they understood it in a much bigger context of a year of celebrating or commemorating other Jewish things. So I'm using the royal we because I'm fairly familiar with the Siddur, but the people that I think that come, the Jews that come on the high holidays, by and large, we'll talk about the people who mostly come only on the high holidays. In many ways, this book is their primary Jewish experience, other than maybe the exception of the Haggadah. And so the book takes a different weight in their minds, I think, than what it was initially intended.
This is the rabbis.
So it was initially intended as a piece of a whole, not as the primary Jewish liturgical experience. And I think that has, I think that is interesting in that people struggle. Bobby, could you mute yourself on the phone, please? That people actually have some theological questions or challenges with the Mahzor. This isn't to say that people don't always also have challenges with the Siddur. I think that any time you take a work that at its core is thousands of years old and try to bring people with a more modern theology to it, you're going to have some questions and some challenges.
Let's try that.
So, having said that, it's always interesting to me, because I think that the high holidays do have their own challenges. It's always interesting to me that when people have, let's say their children are interdating, that they feel that the time that they want to bring, and some of you may have, done this, that if you want to bring someone into Judaism, you want to show them what we're all about, you bring them to the high holidays. Which is, we do because it's so important to us. It's so important to us. But I feel like the challenge of it is it's a very dense service, and the majority of it's in Hebrew. And even though we may have come, like I feel I do, to crave these beautiful tunes that our choir sings, to try to imagine what the experience of somebody that doesn't, that this doesn't resonate with. One of the great Jewish educators of previous generations said, we should really bring them to Simchat Torah. Like, we should really bring them to a time where people are celebrating and they're dancing and it's joyous. Except that there's plenty of seats. We don't sell tickets for Simchat Torah, so there's be plenty of room. The people don't bring their significant Jewish others to Simchat Torah because they don't go to Simchat Torah themselves.
Okay, I can do it with earphones if you're not interested.
So this is all sort of this introduction that I find the words of the Mahzor are sometimes a little challenging even for me, because it's a very specific theology. It's a theology that sets God up as king, right? This is part of the high holiday service, is the idea that it is a coronation day. And we are declaring God. One of the opening prayers is HaMelech. And we are talking about God as the king. And if you think about, and you'll forgive my voice, if you're familiar with the reoccurring music, not the choir pieces, but it goes something like this. Da 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 da. I'll stop there. But if you get the idea, it sounds like, I don't know, the equivalent of pomp and circumstance, right? It's a very, I don't know if it's a march, I don't know, and I'm not, but it is a very sort of formal, it's very different from a weekday nusach, a weekday tune, or a Shabbat tune. And it's supposed to sound like, I guess, we don't know who wrote that tune, it's ancient, but what they thought, if you had a king that was about to come in and put the crown on their head, that this is what the tune was going to sound like. So one of the main themes of the high holiday Mahzor is this idea of coronating God as king. So we're not going to talk about, we could talk a lot about this from a gender perspective and in a democracy and, all of the various things. But the most important thing I think that we can say from a traditional Jewish point of view, which I think could make this a more meaningful way of looking at this, and I say this, people that come on Shabbat regularly hear me say this all the time, which is in pagan religions, if anybody wants to jump in and unmute themselves, who was king? Who was the king? What was the king in ancient and not so ancient government structure? Sorry?
The sun?
Get it. Bye-bye.
Right, so it could be that God was, a part of nature. So the sun was a god, the moon was a god, there were multiple gods. Not one, which is what our Torah comes to teach the world. And if you have a king, that king, by and large, was considered either God or ruled by divine right. And so the Torah comes to tell us that God is king. No human being can be king. Above every human being, and no human being, we're all created in the image of the divine, but no human being For people that just came on, welcome. In the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, there's a mute button. So if you could mute yourself just because of background noise, I would appreciate it. And if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and jump right in and ask it. So the idea that we say that God is king, as opposed to anything else, is actually a very theologically important point, and one that I think that we should, we can get lost in what does it mean to us to have a king today, but should be seen in a historical context of what it means for us to declare God is king, especially this God that we can't see, we can't touch, we can't, we can debate whether we can actually even hear, but this God there's usually at a coronation, there's actually a physical being in the room, and we say we're having a coronation, we're insisting that God is in the room with us, even though we don't have a physical manifestation of God. So that's a very important part of the theme. We're also celebrating creation, right? That Rosh Hashanah celebrates the creation of the world, and this is God's great gift to us, that God has created the world and given it to us. So another theme that runs through the High Holiday liturgy is the idea of creation. And of course, well, actually, I'm going to stop there for a minute because we're going to look at the blowing of the shofar now as examples of how we see that in our liturgy. So if you could turn, if you have your Mahzor in front of you, to page 245. And if you don't have it, we're just going to talk about the shofar. There's nothing actually specifically here that you'd really need to see. Obviously, this is part of the service that everyone is pretty familiar with, right? We blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, unless it's the God. And the question is, why do we blow the shofar? And there are multiple reasons. So I'm going to stop here for a moment, and you guys can feel free to unmute yourself and jump in. Why do we blow the shofar? What are the various reasons that we blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah?
At any time is you just to call the community together.
Okay, so the shofar was used, in ancient times, the shofar was used not just on Rosh Hashanah. The shofar was used in many, many different ways. So it could be one, you're calling the community like, it's a meeting, didn't have cell phones. So it could be to call the community together. So if we take that idea that we're calling the community together, how does that sort of manifest itself then on Rosh Hashanah? Or how do you feel about, not manifest, how does that make you feel when you think about being there on Rosh Hashanah and the shofar is calling us together? Do you have any reaction to that?
It gets your attention.
Well, yes, it gets your attention. I will say, it is the nail-biting moment of the service for me. The choir's going to be beautiful, the sermon it's there in front of me, though. I will say, about a week ago, I had the dream. I thought I was over this, but I had the dream. It was Rosh Hashanah. I didn't have my sermon. I couldn't remember what it was. But the reality is that Nancy takes copies of all my sermons for me. So if God forbid I actually showed up without it, Nancy would have it on the beamer for me. So it really would be fine. Though somebody did ask me recently, I was telling about this dream, and a congregant said to me, well, if you didn't have it, could you figure out something that you could just talk about? So I said, are you asking me if I could just blab about something for 20 minutes not prepared? Sure. Sure.
I would say yes.
Yeah, I could do that. I prefer not to, but I guess I could figure out something. In any case, the nail biting of the shofar blowing is, it's in the moment. You can prepare, but if you can't get a sound out of that ram's horn, oh wow. So luckily we have good shofar blowers, but it's always it's always a little so I think, I suspect, you can tell me if I'm, if you ever felt that way, everybody else is kind of waiting too. We're all kind of waiting, with bated breath, how's this going to be? We're all rooting for the shofar blower. So I think everybody's there waiting. So one thing, calling together. What else does the shofar symbolize in our tradition?
Just to focus us.
Opening up
the gates of heaven?
Okay, so one of the things we talk about is we're trying to get God's attention. So we're trying to get the people's attention. We're also, in case God's not paying attention, right? This is, some shofar is compared, Maimonides talks about it as a wake-up call, right? It's like an alarm clock. So we're trying to wake ourselves up, not just be called to attention, but to call to attention for a reason, for a purpose. And so when Maimonides talks about it as a wake-up call, it's the idea that we are walking through, I'll speak for myself, I walk through life. The Kabbalists, the mystics in our tradition called it being asleep. We walk through our own lives asleep. We're asleep for a lot of reasons, right? We're asleep because we're thinking about the next thing on our list of things to do. We're asleep because we're in our own heads focusing on what may be important or maybe is trivial. Now more than ever, we're asleep because we've got, we're on a screen right now, but, we've got our own private screen in front of our face. We're asleep because we're inundated by the media, and we can't, and the problems are so intractable that it's too painful to read about them all the time, so we shut down. So the shofar comes to wake us up and to say, wait a minute, this is the one life you have. This is it. You don't have any other life. How do you want to live it? Like, do you want to live it asleep, or do you want to be a woken up person? The other thing, of course, is, we want to wake up God. I'll tell you a little interesting little liturgical tidbit. Every month, we, before the new month, on the Shabbat before the new month, at synagogue, we announce that the new month is coming. The only month that we don't do that is for the month of Tishrei, the month where Rosh Hashanah falls. And there's two reasons given in the tradition, why we don't do it. One is, well, who doesn't know it's going to be Rosh Hashanah? Like, we don't need to announce it. Everybody knows it's coming. At the synagogue, we start planning like as soon as Pesach is over. So everybody knows it's coming, so it would be a waste of your time. The other thing that it talks about, theologically, you can, that we don't want to warn the prosecuting angels that we're about to undergo a trial, and we don't want the prosecutor to have ample time to prepare. So maybe the prosecuting angel will not realize that Rosh Hashanah is coming, and they won't have a well-prepared case against us. But in some ways, as Donna said, we also want to get God's attention, right? God, we're here, we're all together, and okay, but there are other, actually, the wonderful thing about Judaism is that the over thousands of years, the multiple layers of any of our rituals go quite deep. So what else does the shofar do in ancient times? What else is it used for?
It's to signal battle charging.
Exactly. Hi, Marcia. Is that you? I recognize your voice. Hi. So it was a battle call. Right? It was a battle call. When you wanted to gather the troops for war, you blew the shofar and out came the soldiers. So it's a battle cry. What else? Well, it was also used at coronations when you would coronate a king.
Oh.
So it was used at coronations. So, of course, this is a coronation. But it was, there's two other ones, but I got to remember them. I remember them. I just remember to say both of them. When, on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, we read a very specific Torah reading, which you may not remember because, first of all, you may not remember, or maybe you're not there the second day of Rosh Hashanah. But the second day of Rosh Hashanah, we read about the binding of Isaac. Right? We read about the great faith of our ancestor Abraham, who was willing to sacrifice his, son Isaac, and takes him up to Mount Moriah and is about to sacrifice him. And the angel stops him and explains that God does not want the sacrifice of human beings. Come on Shabbat where we discuss this. There's so much to say about this. And so what happens? What sacrificed in place of Isaac?
A ram.
Anybody know?
A ram.
Oh,
A ram.
Right.
A ram,
ram.
right? A ram is sacrificed in place of Isaac. The shofar is a ram's horn. So we blow the ram horn to also symbolize our ancestor. Now, again, you can theologically debate what kind of a parent would sacrifice their child, what kind of a God. But if you're looking at this in the eyes of an ancient people, this is seen as the greatest act of faith, that you would be willing to sacrifice your child. And then it's amazing that we have a God that doesn't want that. Because guess what? In pagan times, people practiced child sacrifice. And so it wasn't so obvious. It wasn't obvious at all that God wouldn't want this. So we blow the shofar to remind us of Abraham's great willingness and loyalty to God, and God's great mercy in not wanting us to do that, to teach us that we shouldn't do that. So the ram's horn also reminds us of that. One more thing. Actually, two more things. Rosh Chodesh, we blow the shofar at the new moon, at the new month. That's how people knew it was the new month. As a matter of fact, so it was the announcement of the new month, and Rosh Hashanah falls on the first of Tishrei. So you're letting, in case, that's what you do. You let people know that the new month has begun. The final reason is that when God gives the children of Israel the 10 commandments on Mount Sinai, the shofar is blown. So we also remember on Rosh Hashanah this precious gift of Torah. When we blow the shofar, we're supposed to also remember the 10 commandments, the giving of Torah. So, I don't know, what did we just give? About a half a dozen reasons, all part of our tradition, that this service that we know so well, and is such a meaningful part of the service. How many layers of meaning there really are. And as you can imagine, I find this fascinating, but would be very hard unless I happen to be giving a sermon specifically about the shofar. I don't know that anybody would really appreciate it if I took 20 minutes before the blowing of the shofar, to explain all of the reasons and all of the various levels of meaning of why we're doing this. But I think, like with anything, the more you understand the various layers and the various levels, the more meaningful it is. Then there's also another piece of it, which is how you blow the shofar, right? The various notes. The tekiah is sort of this triumphant, when you hear the tekiah, you hear, this God as king. But there's also the broken notes, right? Shvarim truah, which is supposed to sound like crying, right? Just supposed to sound like somebody crying, like the voice of a human being crying. So why would we want to think about this? I'm actually working on a sermon right now about crying. So if anybody has something really good to say about it, you could get quoted in the sermon. Why would we want to think about crying at a time like this?
It's like an emergency.
Could be. It's like, this is an emergency, right? It's like, I think, this is going to sound crazy, but I think a lot about crying. I don't know if it's a gender thing. I don't know. I don't want to say that it's a gender thing. I will say, I have, I don't know if I should say this is being recorded. My husband is an emotional person, and sometimes he cries, and my sons are emotional men, and sometimes they cry. And if you added that up all together, they don't cry as much as I cry. And so let's just say crying is a part of, my life. Maybe less so now that I'm older. But I think a lot about crying because I do a lot of life cycle rituals, right? I do a lot of funerals, I do a lot of weddings, and it's interesting that I see people crying both at joyous times and at terribly sad times. And I always say to people, and at bar and bat mitzvahs, and I always say to people, like, if no one's crying, I feel like I'm doing a bad job. And then I like ratchet it up, like, you know, like at the wedding. And when they were just a baby and you held it, like I got to like ratchet it up to get some emotion. And I think about that sometimes when I'm, you know, delivering sermons. I tend to think that people like two kinds of sermons. They like either ones that have some humor in them or make them cry. In other words, I feel like it's my job when I'm delivering some of the sermons, not all of them, to make people feel something. When I was in rabbinical school, I had a professor, a rabbi, who was American born, but he spent most of his career working in Argentina. He actually founded the conservative movement in Argentina. And he talked about, like, on his pulpit during the high holidays, he was like instructing us, you know, as students, what are the kinds of things that you need? So you probably need smelling salts because somebody's going to get so emotional that they faint, and you're going to need scotch because, you know, people are going to be crying and somebody might need a drink and, you know, people, and he talked about like the utter, like sort of emotional, like almost hysteria of his congregation. And I like whispered to the person next to me, he has lived outside of North America for a really long time. Because American Jews, I've done funerals for Jews from the former Soviet Union. And their reaction, especially if it's a tragic funeral, people are hysterical. And I actually have had like people talk about wanting to throw themselves into the grave and this unbelievably raw emotion. And at people who are born in America, people really tell me like, oh, maybe I shouldn't wear mascara. I think if I cry a little bit, it might run. And I'm like, you know what? How about not wearing mascara and letting yourself go? You know, we're a little more contained. We're a little more cultural, at least in the Midwest, we're a little more culturally contained. So the broken notes of the crying of the shofar, it's almost as if it's giving us this idea of permission that there's supposed to be some emotion put into this, right? That this is an emotional process. The idea of, if you're really thinking about who you are and you're thinking about what you've done, you got some reason to cry, right? If you are going through something in your life that's frightening, that's scary, that's sad, you're in a health crisis, your loved one is in a health crisis, you got some reason to cry. If you're celebrating something amazing, your kid's getting married, you're getting married, something wonderful's happening in your life, you got a reason to cry, right? That to be able to experience the emotion is really important. And then, of course, the ultimate in Judaism is it's not just about your crying, but what is the wake-up call for?
All of Israel.
That's right. So and I would even add all humanity, right? To sensitize us to hear the cries of others. To sensitize us to hear the cries of others. That, in many ways, is what this whole endeavor is about. Is sensitizing us to hear the cries of others. And if you think about the lists of all the things that we do wrong, some of them are things we do to ourselves. You know, we talk about the sin of eating and drinking, or the wanton look, or, you know, there are things that we do, though one could claim that the wanton look actually does hurt other people. But there are things that we do that we hurt ourselves. But most of the sins are about how we hurt other people, how we hurt society, all the things that, you know, if you think about the things that you'd really like to get better at I think for myself at the high holiday time, the things in myself that I'd want to improve are generally the things that hurt other people, and generally the ones that actually live in my house. So the part of this endeavor is thinking about how we can, you know, not just be better for the sort of, you know, like the laboratory of self-improvement. It's really thinking about what happens when we move out of the four walls of the North Shore Center for the Performing Arts. So that leads me to the other theme of the day. If you could turn to page 282. So all of these things, whether you think of God as king and you think about all of these other emotions, the other theme of Rosh Hashanah is Yom Hadin, which means Judgment Day. And we have an interesting relation to that as well, I think is, I don't know if we're moderns or we're postmoderns, or I don't really sure what the phrase for us. You know, I think, I mean, obviously I think about this a lot. It sounds kind of like a redundant thing to say. So obviously, to be a mentally sort of healthy and stable person, one has to have a healthy balance between really being able to look at themselves and admitting that they've done wrong and saying that they're sorry. But you also can't be so guilt-ridden and think of yourself as such a horrible person that you actually can't function in the world. And so we're supposed to, like so many things in Judaism, the rabbis in the Talmud actually say that we're supposed to carry a slip of paper in each pocket. One slip of paper says, the world was created just for me. And the other slip of paper is supposed to say, remember that my end is dust and worms. So if you're the kind of person that only thinks about how the world was created for you, I guess you would be a narcissist, and nobody, you know, you wouldn't. I'm going to resist the political. And people, well, maybe some people would like you. I don't know, but a lot of people really wouldn't like you. But if you're the kind of person that can only go, oh my God, I'm going to die, you can't function in the world either. But at each time you have to have a little bit of both, right? So sometimes I'm with people and, you know, people say to me, I didn't do anything wrong to deserve this, which is probably from a theological point, you know, of human suffering, probably true, right? But on the other hand, can any of us ever say, I'm not guilty? I haven't done anything wrong. Well, my husband sometimes accuses me of being that kind of a person, that I don't apologize enough, that I'm never wrong. And what I say to him is well, if I was wrong, I'd apologize. I'm just not wrong in this case. So, okay, that's always my challenge at the high holiday period, and of having to admit that maybe I could apologize more and take a little more responsibility. So now I've just bared my soul, but he's not on the call, so don't tell him I said that. So should any of us ever be able to say, like, I have nothing to be accountable for? So I would say of all of the prayers of the high holiday time period, this prayer, the Unatana Tokaf, is the one that I get the most reaction from. People struggle with it. They struggle with it. And I think the reason that they struggle with it is what the prayer, what the prayer says in its, what the prayer says is bad things happen to people. It comes from God. But if you practice prayer and repentance and good deeds, you can change the decree. And I think the negative reaction to the prayer is, but I did all those things. I'm a good person and bad things still happen. So is this prayer saying to me, this is what God is punishing me, that I deserve what I get? So I will admit that if this is your, if this is a theological challenge, the thing with all liturgy is that it's, in some ways, it's, this prayer was written 1,000 years ago. And 1,000 years ago, that probably was pretty much the theology of the time. Though there's always been a counter argument in our tradition, and you see it in the rabbis, and you see it around the destruction of the temple, that nothing we've done is bad enough to merit this. So you've got both happening at the same time, and the question of why bad things happen to good people is alive and real in our theology. Donna, do you have a question?
Yes.
Yeah.
When we were talking about doing things wrong, I remember studying in some group somewhere, and they said that it also includes those things that we just didn't know about. That I just didn't know. It's not like I lied, I made a mistake, or I was wrong, or just all those things that we did that maybe it was me sitting at a stoplight too long and something terrible happened as a result. Just being in the world, and what do you do with the guilt for those things, and those things that I was here, couldn't help it. And so it was all these different levels of not knowing, and then all those things that just by virtue of being here had an impact that we have. Maybe there was good, maybe there was bad, and so that we don't, we balance the pockets with that too.
Okay, thank you. So I want to say that Judaism, I think other than this prayer, there are very, very few places that you find in our tradition that talks about the cause and effect of sin and suffering. I think, and then so people have said to me, well, if we don't really believe that, why don't we edit it out? Why do we still say it? So I always think it's the best choir piece. So we're not getting rid of it. It's the best choir piece. But part of what we always do in our tradition, and for thousands of years, is we carry all the pieces with us, and we reinterpret them to try to make the meaning of them as much as we can, while we acknowledge that for our ancestors, they may have read it differently. Like, listen, I mean, in some ways, like, think about something as simple as Merchant of Venice. Like, as a Jewish person, it's pretty painful, right? I just read, well, this is going to sound really pretentious. I read the Brothers Karamazov this summer because my daughter was reading it for a class in school, and I thought we could have an intelligent conversation. There's a lot of anti-Semitism in it. It's kind of painful. But would you say, like, then let's not read it anymore? Let's get rid of it. Let's not, there are things that are part of, Western civilization that are painful. But we don't say that. Well, that's it. Nobody's going to read them anymore. And I would make that argument for prayer as well, that these are, that the ancient words are holy by the virtue of being ancient. They're holy because our people have said them every single high holiday. Well, I would say this prayer for 1,000 years. And so what sense can we make of it? So first of all, the prayer starts out that we are proclaiming the great sanctity of this day, and that we are at a trial, right? We are envisioning ourselves at a trial, and we are now going to come in front of the judge. And all the angels are there, and it's very dramatic, and, hopefully our defense angel and the prosecuting angel, and yes, Judaism traditionally believes in angels, so, okay, we're just going to go with that. And they say, in Hebrew, Hine Yom Hadin. I could sing it for you, but not as well. Hine Yom Hadin, right? This is the day of judgment. This is it. So the first thing I would ask, is there any merit? Is there any sort of psychological merit? Is there any theological merit for that sense of this is a judgment day? So I'm going to throw that to you and ask you, is there any merit to thinking about yourself being judged?
Could it be a self-judgment?
I think it absolutely can be a self-judgment, and I think if I feel like it's not like we don't have plenty of atheists and agnostics in the crowd on the high holidays. I mean, for sure we do. And I think that being, judging yourself and taking the opportunity to think about your actions. Well, somebody told me about a book that I didn't read. I always quote books I didn't read. But told me about, it was a book for the workplace that talked about, it's almost impossible if you're dealing with an employee that just has certain deficiencies, it's impossible to get them to change those deficiencies. But if you can get them to work and to strengthen their strengths, and if you have any possibility of giving them work that will play to their strengths, you might be able to, keep them employed. So I think about that a lot for me personally with this judgment day. Like maybe I will always be, a person that has these, deficiencies that I will continue to work on. But I think as part of the judgment process, thinking about, but what am I good at that I could actually try to be better at? Like, it doesn't all have to be just so totally like self-flagellating, negative, I'm a horrible person. But, you know, and most of the prayers that we confess to, you know, I've murdered, we've stolen, we've murdered, like, thank God most of them on the list, if, you know, we could probably, you know, cross them off the list. We probably haven't done those things. Like, we could narrow it, you know, to a few things that we've done. But I like the idea of also thinking about, you know, can I strengthen my strengths and not just, you know, focus just solely on the negative. But if we never focus on the negative, how will it ever improve? How will we ever get better if we never take the time to think about it? And so we think in this prayer, we envision ourselves like, slowly, like sheep, which is, you know, humbling. It's kind of a humbling experience every once in a while to think of yourself as not really all that different than a sheep. And we have this vision, right, of God, the shepherd, as we're passing before, and God is counting us. Though it's an interesting metaphor in that a shepherd is generally seen as a protector. Right, a shepherd protects the sheep and cares for the sheep, and makes sure they all stay together, and fights off wild animals, and makes sure that the sheep get somewhere safely. So in this prayer, we have this juxtaposition of a judge and a shepherd. And one of the things our tradition talks about a lot, that we ask God, you know, to judge us with mercy. And somebody quipped once, you know, justice is what we want for, you know, other people to be judged, and we want to be judged with mercy. But the reality is that, again, to have sort of a safe world, you kind of need both, right? There are some things that justice calls for in the world that calls for punishment. If we were only merciful, then you'd have to be, you know, Simon Wiesenthal wrote a book called The Sunflower, where he talks about the story of a Nazi on his deathbed. Simon Wiesenthal was a prisoner. He's a Holocaust survivor, right? So he was a prisoner at that point, and he's called into the bed of this SS man who wants to confess his sins and wants Simon Wiesenthal to absolve him of his sins. So that was, he thought about that the rest of his life, and he had a lot of people write about that. Every Jewish thinker, every Jewish theologian that responded to this question answered the same way. Simon Wiesenthal has no right to absolve this person of his guilt. The only people that can absolve him of his guilt are the victims that he killed. So you don't have the right to vicariously absolve somebody. Every Christian that wrote on this book wrote that if somebody repents on their deathbed, you have to forgive them. They're absolved. They repented in time. So it's theologically a very different way of looking at it. And Judaism says there are certain things that you stand in judgment for. I'm not comparing any of us to Nazis, but there are things that you are responsible for, and you have to take responsibility. And you may even have to, you know, if you were in a real court of law, like, we kind of get off easy. Like, you may be admitting to God that you lied, and what's really going to actually happen? You know, I mean, you're going to walk out of there probably, out of, you know, the high holiday service. In a real court of law, if you stole, except that in our tradition, we're told that there are certain things you have to make amends for, right? You have to make amends to other people. If you did something to hurt other people, you have to apologize. If you stole something, you have to return it. Like, you have to do something. It's not just about these words. You have a responsibility to go to that person and make amends. But at the same time, we have this image of God as a shepherd, a loving, kind shepherd. So let's turn the page. This is the hard part. Again, we sing it. On Rosh Hashanah it is written, on Yom Kippur it's sealed. How many shall leave this world, and how many shall be born? Who shall live, and who shall die? Who in the fullness of years, and who before? Who shall perish by fire, and who by water? Who by sword, and who by a wild beast? Who by famine, and who by thirst? Etc., etc., right? So, of course, theologically, in the Mahzor, it does say repentance, prayer, and deeds of kindness can remove the severity of the decree. At least that's the English translation, which we'll talk about in a second. But this prayer does, and this is why people have a very hard time, particularly people that are ill, do not appreciate thinking about this or being reminded of this. But I think if we step back and we say, let's not look at this as punishment and judgment, right? Let's say that we are theologically more sophisticated than that. But the reality is, in any given year, things are going to happen, right? They may happen to us. They may happen to the people that we love. Something's going to be good. A baby's going to be born, and something bad is going to happen. And that's really, in some level, just the way it is. So if you think about Rosh Hashanah as sort of a wake-up call to get you to change, what this prayer is basically taught in more popular modern, right? Treat every day as if it's the last day of your life, right? How would you act if it's the last day of your life? That's what this prayer is there for, right? You don't know that you're going to have another year. You don't know what's going to happen. So if you don't know what's going to happen, wouldn't that give you a certain immediacy for what you're going to do about your only life that you've been given? Now, we translate, but repentance, prayer, and deeds of kindness can remove the severity of the decree. It's a hard thing to translate because it really actually doesn't say repentance, prayer, and deeds of kindness. In some translations, it says avert the decree. This one's a little bit better. It doesn't avert, but that's not what the prayer says. It doesn't say it averts the decree. So I, God forbid, am diagnosed with a disease, and now I'm going to, give a lot of tzedakah, and God's going to, revert. It's not what it's saying. It's saying that it can remove the forget the English, because this is even saying remove the severity, which means, you'll get a better prognosis, even though your prognosis is bad. If you give more and more tzedakah. What ma'avirin ataro'ah means it sort of pulls away some of the badness. So another way of interpreting this is living a life of repentance, prayer, and deeds of kindness. Doesn't mean that we're not going to get sick. Doesn't mean that nobody's going to die. Doesn't mean any of those things. What it actually, some people suggest, is it means that how we live our lives. The decree is going to come to everyone eventually, everyone we've ever known, every generation. But the kind of life that we live, a life that's filled with the idea of being able to do better, a life where you dedicate yourself to prayer, a life where you dedicate yourself to tzedakah, of taking care of others, it's the quality of the life that you live. And living that kind of life helps you in some way to face the severity of the decree that's going to come to all of us at one point or another. In other words, living that kind of life helps you live a better life, whether you're healthy or ill, or other people are healthy or ill. The quality of your life will be a better life. It will suck away some of the ro'ah, some of the badness of your life by living that kind of a life. So, you know what? Maybe you buy that as an explanation for this prayer. Maybe you're like, oh, you know what? Theologically, I still have a problem with it. But that's how I sort of make sense of it and make it into something that I feel makes it meaningful for someone that lives in our time and not 1,000 years ago. So with the 2 minutes we have left, if anybody has a question, a comment, Wednesday night we're going to look at some prayers from Yom Kippur. That will be recorded. This is recorded. It'll be up on the website in case anybody, that wasn't on the call wants to learn a little bit more in preparation. We are supposed to use this time period to prepare ourselves. We're really not supposed to come into the high holidays cold. We're supposed to use it as a way of thinking about all of these ideas in order to prepare us to have a more meaningful experience. So with that, does anybody have anything they'd like to say, add, ask?
Only one comment when it says when repentance, prayer, and deeds of kindness can remove the severity of the decree. If somebody is really ill, if they can put their own mind in order and say, I've lived the life to the fullest and now it's really time for me to say goodbye, that in that instance, I feel that prayer is very, very worthwhile and very understandable.
Look, I know that there are, everybody, there are people on this call that have faced health crises. There's people on this call that have had terrible losses. Like there's a whole variety, of human experience just represented on the few people in this call. And I would never want to suggest in any way that Judaism, while there are elements of Judaism that maybe over time supported this, I would never want to suggest in any way that Judaism doesn't stand by people in their time of illness because it judges them or feels that this is a punishment from God. But there are many people that tell me, that they thought a lot about during those hard times, like the kind of people that they wanted to be, and that helped them in the face of the vast suffering of human experience. I mean, look, it'd be really great if it really worked. Wouldn't it be great, like, if you could just pray and give a lot of tzedakah and, like, nothing bad would happen? Like, I'd be delighted if that system worked. But it doesn't. Like, we all know it doesn't, and our ancestors knew all too well that it didn't either. You just have to read the book of Job, who we're told over and over suffered for no reason. There was nothing that he did that would cause that suffering. Anyone else?
Rabbi,
Yes.
it's Eileen.
Yes. Hi, Eileen.
I think one other thing that people have to be mindful of when they're comparing the Judaic response to repentance to the Christian response to repentance is original sin, because that's a very important part, certainly of Catholicism and a lot of the Christian faith, and it is not a part of Judaism. So because we do not believe in original sin, we believe that people are born good, the whole repentance process is a little bit different.
Right. Thank you. I'm glad that you said that. I mean, our tradition says, God says when he creates human beings that that the creation of human beings was very good. So the idea is that we do have, sort of an opportunity of every year of trying to have a clean slate. In our tradition, it's actually called the cheshbon hanefesh, which is an accounting of the soul. Right, that we can go through this process and start the year fresh and clean. And actually, interestingly enough, unlike popular understanding of Yom Kippur, the rabbis actually saw Yom Kippur as a day that was intended for celebration. Because if you really had a day where you could really, like, clean your plate and have a fresh start, that is something to celebrate. That you should feel great about having gone through it and come through it, out the other end and cleansed. So I don't know how many people actually, think about it in those terms, but it is in our tradition supposed to be thought of as an amazing opportunity for a fresh start, something that, we all need. So I wish you all a Shana Tova. I don't know if any of you will be on the call, so maybe see some of you Wednesday night, but I hope that I assume I will see all of you next week. So let me wish you a very happy and healthy new year. Shana Tova.
Thank you. Shana Tova. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Shana Tova.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
This was wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.